So it is now my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Frey, Vice President of Total Wellness at Nielsen IQ. She's going to walk us through health, wellness, and sustainability, some of the trends you've definitely seen, heard about in the news media. So with that, please help me in welcoming her.
Thanks, Ellen. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I sat through yesterday's sessions. Can I get a quick raise of hands? How many folks were here yesterday? Oh, fantastic. Okay, I'm gonna bring a few threads through from conversations that we had yesterday, but for those of you that weren't, I'll make sure that you don't feel completely lost, but really, really happy to be here. I'm with Nielsen IQ, as Erin said, and Stacy and the team had asked me to come and talk about what's happening with wellness. So Nielsen IQ, some of you heard from us yesterday and we were talking about the trends. We look at data, so we look at the sales data for wine and what we call consumer packaged goods, so across all retail outlets, and we also track the consumer. And so I'm gonna talk a bit about what's shifting from a consumer standpoint, but just to set the stage, when we talk about wellness, what we are really finding, the consumer is starting to converge the idea of their own personal health and wellness with the health of the planet and the health and social responsibility for others. And so I'm going to talk to you about what that looks like and feels like, how that's morphing beyond just wine, but then what the implications can be for the wine industry, and in particular, the Central Coast. Erin just said that, it's been tough for consumers. The last few years, from an inflationary standpoint, the compounding impacts, we have seen what cost us $100, the products we could buy for $100 in 2019, it's costing consumers $133 to buy those same products. Yesterday, we dove a little bit deeper into what's happening with wine specifically, but we think it's important to always understand that broader perspective of what's happening across all consumer purchases. And it's not great. So the news yesterday, when it wasn't so great about wine, actually you can see alcohol's not doing as poorly as some of the other categories. To orient you to what you're seeing here, and by the way, I'm a data nerd, so drink some coffee because we are going to share a lot of data with you today. All of these slides will be available to all of you to take back, share with your teams, ask us questions after the fact. But what you can see here in that bar chart, the purple shows what's happening in dollar sales. The blue shows what's happening in units. So pretty much across the board, you can see that, and the bottom you can see what's happening in retail prices, even in the latest 52 weeks. Why am I sharing this with you? Because when you see some of the impacts of what's happening with grocery purchases, with baby, with pet care, just where consumers have discretionary spending, all of that does impact their ability to buy wine. We're also seeing that in beauty and personal care. So again, that bigger perspective of what's happening from a consumer standpoint. But it is not all negative. So as I mentioned, we track this idea of better for myself and my health, better for society, better for the planet. And what we found pretty interesting is, you can see, and this is a look, excuse me, this is a look at better for in blue, the growth, versus the conventional, not better for. And what we found, it was really late 2022 into about the third quarter of 2023 where we saw a switch. We basically saw that compounding impact of inflation. People pulled back on wellness. They pulled back on sustainability. It was really where we saw that, it was kind of like, I'm really feeling the effects and I have to make some trade-offs with my values. What we think is pretty exciting is you can see in the third quarter of 2023, that started to switch back. The growth is again stronger in better for than it is in the conventional. And when you look at this is actually from a dollar perspective. When you look at this from a unit perspective, we actually found better for held stronger from a resiliency and just an overall units perspective. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the implications of how better for sustainability really drives loyalty, and it can help your business be more resilient. Thinking about the consumer hierarchy of needs, we do a lot of research at NIQ in terms of how are consumers thinking about their health and wellness. So as you can imagine, at that very base level, right, it's what's most important to me, and we find consumers care about things like, especially, we saw this during the pandemic, it was a wake-up call for many consumers, so things around diabetes, obesity, heart disease, This is where we see that attention that consumers are paying to things like sugar and sodium, what's in my foods, what am I putting in my bodies and in my body and on my body. We find that they're expanding what they're thinking about from a wellness perspective, and so we've seen this expansion of things like mental health, digestive health, mood, etc. As they go down that level, aspirational, we're finding more and more of this look forward of how do I live a life of not just long life, but a life of happiness, a life with like vitality and longevity. And I'm gonna talk a little bit, I'm gonna come back to what's going on with the boomers and some interesting things we're seeing with them later on. Specifically, I wanted to highlight, we have been fascinated to see this idea of altruism, the health of the planet, the health of others, becoming more important to consumers. And when we ask them, we have found 67% of consumers say, I think the environment is having a negative impact on my health. We are finding that they are, really when we say like, why do you care more about sustainability? Like what, when we do consumer research, they say, it's in the media all the time, and I also am finding that I'm being personally affected by weather, by droughts, by floods, and so they are really, it is becoming more and more front and center from a consumer standpoint. This is the first of just a couple data nerd slides for you. So we are tracking this, and I just want to orient you to what you're seeing here. So we track across the entire store. So that horizontal axis, that's the number of categories in the store. And what we're trying to show you is where are we seeing the most claims? Are they in environmental sustainability tied to nature, which you can see that is that blue bubble to the farthest to the right, where we're seeing more and more companies across categories are talking about nature, natural resources, et cetera. You can see in that upper left-hand corner, animal welfare is one of the claims, because it's higher in the bubble chart, that vertical axis shows the growth versus 4 years ago. Really high growth, but it's not in as many categories. The pink bubble is showing you what's happening from a social responsibility standpoint. And then we're starting to see more claims around climate and, of course, packaging. The two biggest takeaways that I wanted to have you see on this slide is the fact that all of these bubbles, other than sustainable packaging, are growing faster than total store. The second thing, I'm so often asked about sustainability, and companies will say to me, yes, consumers say they care, but is there really a business case for it? We have been tracking this closely for the last couple of years, and we have found products that have claims have a 248 basis points more growth than those that do not. That's huge. That is huge, and we have seen that consistently for the last couple of years. The second piece, though, I'm always asked, the first question is that, the second question is how much more can I charge, right? Like what's the price premium I can charge for different sorts of attributes? Not always the case that you can charge a price premium, but the second piece that we find really fascinating is the fact that it is driving more loyalty. And we've heard this from brands as we've shared this research with them. They've said, absolutely, we agree. We know that it's a volume play. We know that it's a loyalty play. We know that when we invest in sustainability, they come back. They're loyal to our brand overall. But what does sustainability even mean? It's such a confusing, it means so many different things to consumers. We wanted to orient you to a little bit of how consumers are thinking about this. So again, another bubble chart. Along the bottom, this is the consumer's awareness of claims. The vertical axis is how important are these to them. And then the size of the bubble, the bigger the bubble means that claim showed up higher for more consumers in terms of the 1 or 2 high importance. Probably not a surprise to you, packaging. Packaging is table stakes when it comes to sustainability. When we ask consumers, what are you doing to live a sustainable lifestyle? The number one things they say to us, I'm trying to recycle. I'm trying to buy recyclable packaging. This is an area that there's interesting opportunities, I think, from the wine industry. I had an interesting conversation with Stephanie from Saxco yesterday about bottle weights, about sourcing of bottles, and she had indicated that she's getting a lot of requests, but many of them are coming from the Pacific Northwest and from Napa. So opportunities, I think, Melanie from Whole Foods, mentioned this yesterday in terms of kind of this being that piece that obviously there's a cost savings standpoint, but just knowing that there's also a greater and greater consumer awareness around packaging and package types. You can also see things here, big bubbles around responsible sourcing or natural resources. So I want to talk a little bit about what's happening in terms of this consumer awareness around things like soil health. We've been really fascinated to see over the last couple of years this increase in consumers buying. And again, we're not just showing what they're saying. This is actually where you're seeing increases in sales. But the awareness that consumers have on things like soil health, biodiversity. And part of this is, you're seeing major conversations, that are happening in the space. Regenerative agriculture. Obviously, this is a hot one here in California. The state of California is kind of in that listening and workshop period, but intending to come out in the June and July timeframe with a California definition, California's view and definition of regenerative agriculture. You've got major retailers like Walmart and General Mills who are partnering together to say we are going to transition 600,000 acres to regenerative agriculture in the Midwest. And you might think, do consumers really know? Do they really understand this? There's kind of two sides of that. One thing, don't forget, during the pandemic, 1 in 3 people started gardening. The growth of consumers that are understanding plants, that are understanding gardening, and just soil health in general. And at the same time, we have done some research in the US and globally asking about regenerative agriculture. And consumers say, I love it, I'm buying it all the time. And we know that that's not really the case, right? We know that these are just also 2 words that are really great words, regenerative and agriculture. And so I kind of bring that to you because this is that area that is an industry, not just a wine industry, but an entire industry. We're in this definition time period, but just the pure fact that we're seeing sales growth, consumer interest, and consumer knowledge has major implications. I'll tell you the one thing that we're finding pretty interesting. So we're seeing all this, claims on packages, growth in it around soil health. What we have not really seen yet, but we are expecting to see more in the future, is more claims around water conservation, water usage, et cetera. We see it in the CPG space, but we mostly are seeing it actually in things like household cleaners, laundry detergents, et cetera. But we anticipate, quite frankly, because of global water challenges, and frankly, I even hesitate to talk about water in California, right? You all know this, but across our country, the challenges that different municipalities are having around water, we anticipate this will be something we'll see more in the future. We're always asked, talk to me about the consumer. How's the consumer thinking about sustainability? And so I wanted to share with you a perspective of, and there's a spectrum, right? We all fall into different places, but there are people that are super passionate there in the dark green around sustainability. We call them the evangelists. I'll tell you what, they are actually very high wine drinkers. They are the consumers, though, that are educating all of us on recycling, but they're good for this industry. Other end of the spectrum, you've got skeptics. These are folks in that hot pink. There's about 34% of them in the US. They tend to say they don't really care about sustainability. We watch what they say, what they do, and what meaning that they ascribe to it. They frankly are not big wine drinkers, they're big beer drinkers, so we're gonna ignore them for a second. The idealists are a pretty interesting group, and I'm gonna talk generationally in a second. They tend to be younger. These are folks that tend to talk a big talk, but they don't always put it into action. They are not big wine drinkers, but they are big spirits drinkers, and they are big sparkling wine drinkers. So they are, again, a little bit of that looking for the lighter aspect. But one thing on that group in orange that I want to call your attention to is they really care about how products are sourced, the people. Was everybody along the supply chain treated well? Minimalists, let's ignore them too. They say they don't care about sustainability, but actually when we look at what they do, they live very sustainably. They're not big wine drinkers either. They drink a lot of non-alc. But the ones I think that are in particular, and again, why I thought it was great that they said, come talk about wellness, because the great opportunities in this industry are really thinking again about how this all comes together from a wellness standpoint. When you think about claims, there are certain claims that are really resonant across all the groups. Again, packaging, waste. We know consumers are very concerned about waste overall and our products being responsibly sourced. Now, many of you are watching what's happening in Europe in terms of the, kind of requiring more certification around the claims that are put on packages to get rid of things like greenwashing, where brands are kind of talking about things but not actually executing. There's an interesting phenomenon that's happening right now. We're also seeing brands who are doing great things who are not talking about it and pulling back on that. It's called green hushing because they're worried to have a target on their back. We think there's just an interesting opportunity to think about how do you talk about this to consumers in a way that is meaningful to them, but also shows the transparency of what you're doing. I wanted to share a little bit about what's happening. We talked a bit yesterday from an NIQ standpoint on the generational aspects. So I wanted to share a little bit about what we're seeing across the generations. Two, quick highlights for you. One, we always hear that younger consumers are the ones that are driving sustainability, but I really want to call your attention to the fact that boomers and older consumers actually do care. They care about the environment. They care about the legacy of how we are leaving. And you can see things that they purchase. And this is, again, across the entire store. So it gives you that view of what might be important for them in the wine industry. They also, though, have very specific health ailments that they are struggling with. And so this does start to have the conversation that we were having yesterday around moderation. But one thing I will tell you about those boomers, they are living longer than they ever have before. There's this whole 90's the new 40, which honestly, I'm almost 50. I think that's awesome if 90's the new 40. The other end of the spectrum that I want to call your attention to is those Gen Zers. They are, again, this is all Gen Zers, not just ones that are 21, but in particular, you can see they care about those social aspects. They care about things like animal welfare. They care about things across the store in terms of that social responsibility. These are the consumers that are paying attention to labels, clean label, ingredients, no artificial colors, etc. So when you think about what's kind of coming into the marketplace, interesting perspective, they're also very health-oriented and health-focused. So again, something to kind of watch, something to think about from that consumer standpoint. Now, for those of you that are Gen Xers in the room like I am, I did not forget to put something on the slide. We just continue to be the most unremarkable generation. Nothing indexes high for us at all. But again, this gives you a bit of a perspective of what's happening and where the opportunities are and where things are shifting. I'll tell you one other thing that we are finding super interesting about those Gen Zers. As they are coming into the marketplace, we're actually finding that they love shopping in stores. So they're digital natives, right? They grew up on social media. Amanda's going to take you through some really interesting things as you think about how do you market to consumers. But they actually are coming back in the store. They want to go in the store, they want to touch, they want to feel, they want the experiences. Now we're watching to see, will that continue? Or will that shift as they start having children? Is it because they're frankly the generation that's coming out of COVID and having been on lockdown, and so they want to be in store? Not sure, but we think there are some interesting implications for those of you that have tasting rooms in terms of, again, that experience that you can offer that younger consumer. The last piece I do want to share with you, because I think it is important for you just to be watching overall, is what's happening in terms of ingredients and what's happening in terms of these weight loss drugs. So from an ingredient standpoint, it started out in California. We always are watching you guys, by the way. Everything always starts in California, and the rest of the country we just watch, with the Skittles law, right? And it was about very specific ingredients like red dye, et cetera. What's happening now is these bans are popping up all over the country. And will they go through, will they not go through? Likely not across many of the states. It's kind of being pushed up to a federal standpoint. But I bring this to your attention because the more, we are just seeing this more and more, both from a positive and a negative. The positive is on ingredients, we're seeing consumers paying more attention, as you saw from those Gen Zers, to labels. They're looking at what ingredients are. They're more knowledgeable than ever about functionality of ingredients. And on the flip side, there's a little bit of a lack of trust, in our food system. And especially when you look at many of these ingredients that are banned in Europe, there becomes this kind of confusion from a consumer standpoint. And even if these don't actually get banned, the reality of being out in the consumer knowledge of conversation, it has implications for things like sulfites in the wine industry. And I say that because I often talk about the beauty industry, where 50% of the beauty category in the last 5 years has become no sulfates, no parabens. But if you ask a consumer what's a sulfate or a paraben, they have no idea. They just know they don't want it in their products. And so this reality of science and consumer confusion kind of mixing. The last piece I'll just end on is the GLP-1. So you've heard about Ozempic, Mounjaro, et cetera. We're watching this very closely, but I will tell you the one thing that we're seeing is that there has been a pullback in these consumers in their wine consumption. They're shifting in terms of kind of their behavior overall, so it's just something we would highly recommend as an industry you keep your eye on. They're not completely cutting back on things like spirits, but they are cutting back on wine. So again, lots of questions, lots to still be tracked in that space. But just a piece in terms of a potential headwind for the industry. With that, thanks so much for your time.